Hello YouTube, welcome back to Brunger Builds. Today, I'll be building this Star Wars themed cargo container with a fully functional droid interface socket and a control panel with lights and sound. Alright, for starters, aside from one paid file, all the other files I used on this project were found for free on Thingiverse. I'll be sure to link them as well as all the other materials I used down in the description below. This box was a birthday gift for a close friend of mine. I asked him if I could make him anything in the Star Wars universe for his birthday, what would it be? And after a little back and forth, he settled on a Star Wars shoebox. At first, I didn't know how I would make the building of a box an interesting video to watch, and so I hopped on Thingiverse to get the creative juices flowing. My ideas really started to take shape after I came across this model of a chest from the video game Jedi Fallen Order. As you can see in the original model, there's a droid interface port built into the left side of the lid, but nothing about it is functional. Anyway, this detail really stuck out to me, and I began to wonder if I could turn that interface into a functioning switch that would turn on lights and a sound module. But more on that later. Here's my version of the box. Aside from tweaking the height and width of the body of the box, I also did a bunch of adjustments to the lid so that it would hold all the electronics I would need. After my Commander Bly helmet build a few weeks ago, I thought that I had fixed my layer shifting issues, but as you can see, I was still dealing with those issues during the printing of the box. And so a lot of time was spent cleaning up the two halves and gluing them together. Here you can see me cleaning up some pesky support material that was really jammed into the cracks on the side of the box. I used some 5-minute epoxy for the initial glue up of the two halves, and then once that had dried, moved on to my plastic welder. This thing comes in really handy and provides a nice secure bond between the two pieces of PLA. I was getting a little bit of wiggle in some of the spots where the metal pieces had melted into the plastic, and so to fix this I just dripped a little bit of super glue down into the cracks. I knew that I would be using a lot of wood filler to hide the seams between the two pieces of PLA, and so to keep the use of wood filler to a minimum, I first used this gap filler foam that I had laying around. This foam isn't structural at all, it just serves as an easier way to fill deeper into the voids between the two pieces. And then with most of the crack filled with this foam, I could use less wood filler to hide the seam. I had to print the little latch pieces for the lid separately, and to strengthen the connection between the two pieces I used some super glue and brad nails. This created a bit of a happy accident since I then decided to add magnets to the opposing side of the latch, so that the lid would always seat nicely in the box. Here you can see me cleaning up the foam after it had dried, and then pushing it back ever so slightly so that the wood filler has a bit more surface area to grab onto. From there, it was just a lot of wood filling, sanding, filler primer, and more sanding. But for your sake, we'll skip over that. Okay, let's briefly touch on the SCOMP link switching mechanism. I did a bunch of searching online before finally coming across this model by Masasi on CG Trader. Up until this point, all the other models that I was finding only offered a single layer of rotation for the SCOMP link. But what really set his model apart was the ability to have 2 layers rotating in opposite directions simultaneously through the use of some fancy gearing in the center of the pieces. I want to make sure that I give him a proper shout out since I'm really thankful for people like him who are much better at designing and modeling than I'll ever be. For the lights and sounds side of this project, I found this little module on Amazon. It has 4 slots for custom sound and 4 other slots for LEDs. I only used 3 of the sound slots and 1 of the LED slots. I have absolutely no knowledge when it comes to programming things like Arduinos for lights or sound, and so for around 20 bucks, this seemed like a great option. I did a bunch of testing off camera, but eventually settled on using this cabinet switch to function as my button for both lights and sound. When the little post on the switch is pressed down, the wires are disconnected and the button is off. When the post springs back up into place, the wires connect and it triggers the button. The sound and light module turns on with a click of the button and off with another click of the button. So in order to get this specific switch to work for my needs, I modified the very bottom disk layer of the SCOMP link. I added 2 divots into the disc so that as the SCOMP link layers spin, the switch can click into position and turn the lights and sound on. And then as you spin the SCOMP link a second time, the switch clicks into the second position, turning the lights and sound off. Alright, making 3D printed parts look like metal. If I can pat myself on the back for a second, this is a technique that I feel like I'm getting pretty good at. Before you apply your metal color, you'll want to do a base coat of semi-gloss black. I've seen other people do gloss black, which I think adds even more shine to your metal, but so far I've liked the results that I get with semi-gloss. Before painting this latch section black, I did a bit of pre-weathering. I talked about this in my Kylo Ren lightsaber build video, but I've found that I get really good results when I pre-scratch my metal pieces. Doing your scratches before you paint your pieces black ensures that these scratches also take on the same metal color as the rest of the piece. Once my black base has dried, you can see that I'm using a bit of kids craft glue to do some liquid masking. Overall, I've had good results with this method, but during this project, I had some glue that stuck and wouldn't come off. So use this technique at your own risk. When you're dry brushing your metal color, it's really easy to overdo this step, and so I recommend doing many light passes until it looks right to you. I like to keep in mind that the high points of a metal piece are typically going to be a bit shinier than the lower points, since the high points are more likely to come in contact with hands or other surfaces, which will kind of add a buffed look to the edges. For the sides of the box, I first dry brushed a darker shade of metal color, and then went over top of that with a lighter shade, ever so slightly, just to bring out a bit more detail. I plan to paint most of the side panels white, and then to chip away some of that white paint, so most of this metal color is not even going to be seen. For most of these pieces, I used Vallejo's gunmetal gray and duraluminum, with a few hints of copper or white aluminum here or there. This is something I didn't touch on earlier, and so I'll take the time to talk about it now. Apologies for my big head being in frame during most of these shots. This is the control panel that I modeled to go along with the SCOMP link. It's what's going to house all of my lights and sound. You can see on the bottom right, I plan to have flickering lights in that large rectangle, as well as a few buttons on the side and a few blinking lights up at the top right corner. The larger circular shapes on the left of the piece have holes for sound to pass through. Again, none of these files are actually modeled by me, but I did need to do a lot of tweaking in Blender to get everything to work together and fit exactly how I needed. Out of all the different design eras of Star Wars, I think I'm definitely the biggest fan of the original trilogy. And so throughout this build, I was making sure that all of my aesthetic choices matched as closely to what they would have done in those original movies as possible. And actually, a few of these pieces are just ripped straight out of the original trilogy, namely those 3 switches which can be seen all over the Falcon, as well as that center greebly piece which can be seen on the headrests of the chessboard bench in the Falcon, and that lower left circular piece which is the restraining bolt that the Jawas put on C-3PO and R2-D2. Using a few of the design elements that are actually in the original movies helped set me on the right path when it came to picking other greebly bits for this control panel and the switch panel on the front of the box. I also printed and painted R2-D2's SCOMP Link arm. I feel like you don't normally see primary colors in Star Wars, and it was interesting to see in the reference photos the use of such bold colors on these tiny little details. And here are all my pieces painted up and ready to be assembled. Okay, earlier I didn't really show how the SCOMP Link model works, so hopefully this section will give you a better idea of the internal workings of this piece. Here you can see how the gear mechanism works. One side turns clockwise and the other side turns counterclockwise. During this whole assembly, I had to be really careful not to get any glue into places that it didn't belong, since I needed all of these pieces to spin smoothly. Also, the mechanism on this model was pretty precise, and I had to make sure that every piece lined up so that there was no binding. Needless to say, it was a bit nerve-wracking as I began gluing pieces together. I definitely took my time with this process and did a bunch of dry fitting, but it still scared me every time I glued a piece down, since I knew there was no way I was getting these pieces apart once the glue set. To help the 2 layers of discs spin smoothly against each other, I made this little slippery washer to go between the two of them. It's just cardstock and special tape that is meant for drawer slides. I'm not exactly sure what the official name of this tape is, since I've had it lying around forever, but it's just very smooth and slippery on one side. I also made one of these slippery washers for the bottom of the entire mechanism, but ended up removing it since it actually made the entire mechanism too tight to spin. And here's the entire mechanism working perfectly. Alright, now we're going back to the electronics. Again, I know almost nothing about electricity, but wiring up a few LEDs is actually a pretty straightforward process. I bought a giant batch of white LEDs a long time ago, and so whenever I need a colored LED, I just use some alcohol ink to dye the outer coating of the bulb. I printed these little red and yellow squares in clear resin, and then dyed them with alcohol inks as well. Here I'm drilling holes for rows of LEDs that will sit in the bottom of this box underneath the control panel. Because I didn't have a lot of vertical space in the lid where these lights would be sitting, the simplest solution that I could think of was to just fold all the positive leads down onto each other and all the negative leads down onto each other, making a few rows, and then soldering those rows together, making sure that the positives and negatives stayed completely separate through the whole process. And then once they were all soldered together, connecting them with some heat shrink to some wire that would then connect to the other positive and negative leads on the control panel. And here you can see the lights are all working as they should. I used a little bit of wax paper to diffuse the light before clicking them into position. From there, it was just keeping track of the other 4 LEDs, making sure that they were connected properly and had enough wire slack to be in the positions that they needed to be. I then connected the 2 buttons that would activate 2 sound slots on the module and glued them in place beneath the light up buttons. Here's a little demo. After my metal color had dried, I first went over these side panels with Vallejo's chipping medium, and once that had dried for about 20 minutes, I painted it white. Up until this point, I've had pretty good success with this chipping medium, but for some reason this time it caused my white paint to orange peel. I think I may have applied the white paint a bit too thick too quickly, but like I always say, I knew I could fix it in weathering. In order to add a bit more visual interest to what would otherwise be a big, boring white panel, I designed this stencil in Photoshop and had a friend of mine cut it out on his Cricut. Again, this was another instance where I should have designed my piece a bit smaller than I needed it to be, since the edges of the stencil were a bit too large and caused the overall stencil to bow, which then allowed a bit of bleed on my black paint. During the chipping stage, I also had problems. I think doing a coat of white paint and then black paint allowed the chipping medium to dry for a bit too long, and so this chipping process was a lot tougher than it usually is, and I had to spend a lot of time working one single area before anything came off. In the end though, I was really happy with the way that it looked, and once I was sure everything was dry, I clear coated it before moving on to masking. After masking up the white panels and the metal pieces on the box, I went over the entire thing with a textured spray paint. This served 2 purposes in that it further broke up the flat surfaces of the box and added more visual interest, but it also helped hide a bunch of the layer lines that I didn't bother to fill. However, I did learn a valuable lesson at this step though, which is always fill your layer lines, because no matter how much I sprayed, there were still a few visible layer lines that in the end are not super visible, but they're still just there ever so slightly. So again, always do at least a little bit of filling on your layer lines. I will also say that a can of this Rust-Oleum spray didn't go very far, and I actually went through 4 entire cans before I was happy with the result. The next day, after everything had dried, I began painting the exterior of the box. Unfortunately, in a triple whammy, I ran out of paint sooner than I expected. My camera died, so I have no footage of the process, and the hobby store was out of the paint that I needed. But This was a happy accident because the blue color that I ended up using instead actually turned out to be way better than what I initially bought. It's a much nicer gray blue. It feels very much like the color you would see on an old 50s or 60s mechanics toolbox. And I feel like that vibe is perfect for the original trilogy aesthetic. Alright, onto the interior of the box. Again, because this build is just a box at the end of the day, I knew that I wanted to cram it with as many details as I possibly could to make it interesting to look at and also make it interesting to watch me build it. So I knew I needed to give some sort of detail to the inside to really make it feel like a completed piece. After quite a bit of Googling, I finally found this 2D stencil by the Rebel Base build on Patreon that he had listed for free. And after a bit of photoshopping, I created a custom image that I was then able to extrude in Blender and turn into a 3D model. In order to get the model to print properly, I had to print it in sections, but I was really happy with the result. And in my quest to continue learning new prop building techniques, I decided to try my hand at making these pads look like leather. To accomplish this, I first brushed all the padding with UV resin. And after the resin had settled for just a minute, I cured the pieces with my UV light. From there, I mixed up that same UV resin with some cornstarch to thicken it and used a sponge to stipple the surface of all the pads, leaving the UV light on so that as I stippled the resin, it would be curing before the resin had time to level out. And in the end, I was left with this very nice, organic, bumpy texture. The nice thing about working with UV resin is that as soon as it was cured, I was able to paint it. And once that paint had dried, I began stippling on a darker brown color. Initially, I went a bit lighter with my brown stippling, but I didn't really like the color that was resulting, and so I went a bit thicker with my layers until I was happy with the overall color. Once the paint had dried, I hit it with a flat clear coat, and once the clear coat had dried, I installed the pads into the box. Again, I had to do a bit of gentle massaging and trimming to get all the pieces to fit nicely together. And once I was sure everything fit, I glued it all down, and from there, moved on to weathering. I say this in almost every one of my videos, but weathering is definitely my favorite stage of the entire building process. It's totally up to you how light or heavy you go in this stage, but this is really where you begin to add the character to your prop. Instead of just throwing scratches wherever I feel like it, I'm always trying to think, what is the story behind this piece? If this were a real container in some spaceport somewhere, where would it be getting scratches as it slid around a ship or slammed onto the docking bay? Which edges would receive the brunt of the scratches? Which surfaces would just get lightly nicked? I'm also looking at reference photos of real-life crates and just trying to get a general idea of where a box like this would receive scratches in the real world. And once I was done with all this heavy scratching and scuffing, I moved on to adding the electronics. Here you can see I drilled 2 holes for the positive and negative lead that will go to the cabinet switch at the bottom of the SCOMP link that will act as my third and final button. This was another one of those scary instances where there was absolutely no going back after I glued these pieces together. So I did a bunch of dry fitting to be really sure that everything worked before I committed. I wired up the cabinet switch and stuck it into its little slot at the base of the SCOMP link and held it in place while the glue dried. Here you can see that the cabinet switch adds a bit of resistance to the overall spinning mechanism and kind of prevents everything from spinning super smoothly. But overall, it's still a pretty nice spin with a very satisfying click as it hits its on position. This control panel also had a bit of a tight fit, and here you can see me scrambling to make sure it seats properly before the glue sets up. Alright, we are now in the final steps of this almost 2-week-long process. I say this in all my videos, but don't be afraid to use the cheapest possible acrylics for your washes. I mixed up my wash pretty thick for the faux leather padding, but then thinned it way down for the rest of the box. This was because I wanted that extra gunky buildup in the nooks and crannies of the leather, but then wanted it to flow nicely across the surface of the box without building up too much. I also applied it very carefully around the control panel and SCOMP link, since I didn't want any water getting into the electronics. Another thing I'm keeping in mind is that I'm making sure that the wash is a bit darker towards the bottom of the box as opposed to the top, so that it gives the appearance that this thing has kind of sat in the dirt for a bit. Finally, we're at the last step of the process, which is still my all-time favorite step, and that is using pastel chalks. I use a mixture of matte Mod Podge and IPA and spread the chalk around. Depending on the look that I'm going for, I might also scrape some chalk into the nooks and crannies. This will kind of add a more gunky buildup. Again, the amount that you use this technique is totally up to you, but it's a really easy, great way for adding texture and grime to any piece. If you go light with the application, you're left with just a nice, dusty, chalky surface. And if you go heavy, you've got kind of a chunky, grimy look that could look like mud or dirt, or if you use the right color combination, like rust or corrosion. Once I'm happy with the way my weathering looks, I make sure that my matte Mod Podge and my washes have had time to fully dry, and then I cover the entire thing in one final coat of matte clear. This helps seal everything and protect it. And then this big old box is ready for its glamour shots. If you made it this far into the video, thank you very much for watching. This project was a massive undertaking and required a ton of learning on the fly, but I'm incredibly proud of the final result. If you'd like to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, since I plan to drop a new video every Saturday. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed so far. Have a great day.